I'm Alan Wartes, and you're listening to Think Radio.
Talking about what's going to happen to you when I die, what's going to happen to me when I die. It's a conversation we're not having.
That's from my conversation with Rachel Wartes. She's a licensed funeral director in Madison, Wisconsin, and also my daughter. We talked about her often misunderstood and even maligned profession, but also about death and what our society can do better to prepare for it and to properly observe it with ceremony. It's a great conversation you won't want to miss on this episode of Think Radio.
Think Radio is supported by the Gunnison Country Times, Gunnison's locally owned hometown newspaper, and by listeners like you. To find out how you can become a Think Radio supporter, visit kbut.org.
Rachel, thanks for coming by. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
All right, thanks for having me.
And I think we need to acknowledge right off the bat that it's no accident or coincidence that you and I have the same last name.
Absolutely.
You're my daughter.
Yep.
All right, just wanted to be clear about that. You came to town for a family birthday, and here we are, taking an opportunity to have a conversation that we've talked about having for a long time, because you have a really interesting and I would say unusual job.
Sure, absolutely.
Tell us about it.
So I'm a funeral director, which for those of you that are unfamiliar with that somewhat more modern term, an undertaker, a mortician, but the new term is funeral director. So.
Yeah, well, let's stop right there for a second, because where did the term undertaker come from? I mean, that's sort of what you think of in the Wild West. Every little town had an undertaker. What did that even mean?
Yeah, I don't really know where the word came from. I don't know where the term came from. There truly is what you think of as really an antiquated term. Somebody that, had a furniture business or cabinet making business back in the 1800s, 1900s. Somebody that then also took care of making the coffins for people and thereby providing that service. The family still took care of most of the preparation of the body and really the funeral itself. And the church took care of the funeral service, but you needed someone to make the coffin. And that's really where the undertaker came in.
You needed someone to undertake that task.
Exactly.
Making the coffin and digging the grave and making final disposition of dead bodies. I don't know. I kind of like the term. It's so romantic. Funeral director seems a little bit sterile by comparison.
It is, and it's a little bit vague. What does that mean? What do you do? But I think it's trying to encompass, a changing term for the way that the profession itself has changed over time to a profession where just the term undertaker or mortician and the imagery that kind of induces in people, that is very much not all-encompassing. We do so much more than just
prepare bodies.
Final disposition, that you really need a new term.
Well, and, there was that term in the middle there. It's a good thing that you don't have to say, I'm a mortician anymore, because that's the one that kind of makes people sort of slowly back up and head for the door. Yeah,
and the term mortician comes from, mortuary, and that's a little more once it kind of moved out of the home and out of, you really had mortuaries. It started to be more of a business unto itself, then it came to mortician. And I think if you hear that term today, it's meant to be a little bit chill-inducing.
Yeah.
I think people use it because it makes people go, ugh. And
we use it a lot around Halloween.
Exactly. And you do encounter it still, and it's still a term that some people would describe themselves as. Yeah. But I think really, truly, the term you're going to hear more and more is funeral director.
Okay, so you've alluded to the fact that funeral director as a term encompasses so much more. What? What is it that a funeral director does today that a mortician didn't do and that an undertaker didn't do?
The biggest thing is that as people have moved away from the church, and, as a society, we don't attend churches regularly. We may not have as deep connections in a spiritual community. There's a lot of factors involved in that. We work more, but we also, I think, as a society, we are a lot more transient. So we're moving around a lot more. You don't
That's
become
true.
as entrenched in your community.
Right.
And people have just, I think, churches of all faiths have struggled with keeping up with, modern times and staying relevant. And I think the byproduct of that is that when it comes to funerals, what do? It really used to be that the church dictated what a funeral service looked like. So you had
There
your
were religious
mass.
norms
Yeah.
that were followed.
Absolutely. And people expected that. And there wasn't a lot of deviation from that. You see that a lot still in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in particular has really stuck to very old funeral traditions. So there's not a lot of personalization. But as a society, we have started to get away from our deep religious and church connections. And a byproduct of that is that there's a lot more need for, a personalized service. We all, as humans across any culture and across any time period, have a desire to honor and recognize someone's life and the passing of someone. There are very deep traditions there and rituals. And so as we're getting away from the church, people are starting to really look, in some ways, to the funeral profession itself for those. So as a, coming back to your question, as a funeral director, we are now expected to be more like event planners. We're expected
Well, it's a complex
be,
moving machine.
Right. And we're trying to not only take care of the disposition of your loved one's body, but we're also trying to provide that meaningful service for people, something that the church used to provide.
Yeah, and so let's talk about that for a minute because, there are a lot of things that can be sort of outsourced. In some ways, that's what you're talking about. Families outsource the things that a funeral director does that used to be things that they did. Same thing is true of churches. Is this one of those things that can be outsourced? I mean, how do you generate meaning at the end of someone's life when you don't even know who they are? You have had no connection with their community or their family.
Right.
Is that an unrealistic expectation?
Oh, no. You have to be very good at your job. And that's the goal. And you're right, it is a lofty goal, but that is the goal of funeral directing today, is to try to provide that, and we have to, in a short amount of time, try to get to know your family
Right.
and get to know your loved one and what is meaningful and what might be meaningful. And sometimes we hit the mark and sometimes we don't. And coming back to your question about outsourcing, yes, absolutely. But I think especially in a time of crisis and a time of trauma, people need someone guiding them, someone directing them. Where do we go? What do we need to be doing?
Right.
And it doesn't mean they don't want to honor their loved one and be involved. It just means they need someone providing that completely outside perspective, someone that is removed from the situation who's able to guide them through. That is something the church used to provide. And don't get me wrong, they still provide to many, many people, but more and more, the funeral director is starting to step up and try to take that role.
Right. And so this next question, I fully admit, is a little unfair because I'm asking you to talk about your profession, your chosen line of work, and the thing that you've invested so much
Don't worry.
in.
I love talking about it.
Yeah. Well, but I'm going to ask you to almost make a value statement about the idea of outsourcing. I mean, in other words, do you think it's a good thing that people can no longer want to rely on a faith community to do the kinds of things that you do day in and day out?
No, not at all. And although I absolutely love what I do, and I think there is a balance to be had there, I think it's sad because I see every day families that come in and they're experiencing a loss and they have a strong faith, and it provides a sense of comfort and a guiding light for them, and people that have no faith at all. And I'm not talking about a connection to a specific church. I'm talking about a connection to a spiritual faith. it makes it so much harder. And that's something
Sure.
that no one is going to be able to provide for you. I think there's a balance.
Mm-hmm.
It was a little too cookie cutter for a very long time, and that's not meaningful either. But I think there is a balance to some of these deep traditions and rituals that provide a way through.
Yeah, because that can be ground that's not pulled out from under your feet
Correct.
when pretty much everything else is when you lose a loved one. That also brings up the question of the responsibility of the person who just died, because you think really at that point they're not really playing much of a role. But in the years leading up to their death, maybe they could have. And I'm not just talking about buying a plot and getting a plan paid for, but to prepare themselves mentally and emotionally, and also their families. Do you see a trend toward that? Are people starting to figure this out, that it's not good to go into this transition completely unaware?
Yes and no. That's a huge question. And that's part of the reason that I'll tell you, I love talking about it, because I think death in general is something that we as a culture, especially as a Western culture, we don't talk about it. And you see the difference that makes. That is, it makes it so much more painful, I think, when it does happen, because you have not had that chance to prepare yourself for your loved one's death, but also for your own.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. You see it kind of both ways. I would say on the whole, we're not good at talking about it.
You want to clear a room.
Right.
Start
Right.
talking about getting ready to die.
And we don't do that. We don't talk about it. We're very, we don't talk about it in the sense of our own death.
Mm-hmm.
We might talk about it in generalized terms, in more vague terms, but about you and me, talking about what's going to happen to you when I die, what's going to happen to me when I die.
Mm-hmm.
It's a conversation we're not having.
And so obviously that begs the next question. In your experience dealing with this day in and day out, why do you think that's true?
I think we're afraid of it, afraid of our own death and afraid of the death of our loved ones. And I think it is a product of the fact that death has moved completely outside the home. Even though that is my job, that is everything I do.
Well, and here you're not just talking about what happens after death, but what happens in the moments leading up to death. If you die at home, you're more likely to be surrounded by loved ones.
Yeah.
And the whole thing gets a little
But I'm
demystified.
but
Is
at
that
the
what you
same,
mean?
yes and no. I'm also talking about in the time after. I mean, the time after, the hospital staff shows up or the funeral director shows up and whisks the body away, and you don't see it again until maybe at the funeral home before the service, or as cremation is rising, and it means that we don't know what happens. There's a lot of mystery. And so much of, I think, the fear of it comes from unknown. And I think we need to be having these conversations. We need to be talking about it.
And when you say we, who are you talking about?
Everyone.
Just society in general.
Society in general. And particularly talking about, Western cultures. I think we don't do a good job of ritualizing and honoring and facing death.
So that's sort of big picture stuff. Let's bring it down to the personal. Because, let's face it, somebody who says, yep, I've made up my mind, I'm going to be a mortician or a funeral director or someone involved in mortuary science. Like I said, that's a good way to clear the room.
Yeah, it is.
What brought you into this profession? What was it about this work that made you look at all the possibilities that were in front of you and say, okay, that's where I want to invest my life?
There's a really big need here. I mean, my own personal journey was, an evolution of opportunities and happy chances. But really what really solidified my interest in this is that there's a need for it. I mean, the ability to successfully help create a meaningful service for someone's loved one is incredible.
Was there some experience that really brought that need home to you? Can you think of a time where you saw it and really thought, oh my gosh, I have to do something?
Not really. A lot of times you will hear, oh, I lost a grandma, or at my uncle's funeral, it was so amazing, it really changed my life. For me personally, I saw a need to care for our elderly. a need to really care for our aging population. And that got narrowed down to, well, maybe funeral directing, and I don't know if you remember this, it was actually yourself, just a conversation about, what do I do? What do I want to do? And you yourself said, well, have you ever thought about a funeral home? And it was great.
Oh, sure.
I know.
Blame it on me.
I do blame it on you. But it was great. It was a light bulb moment for me where I went, no, I hadn't thought about that at all. Being blessed enough in my own life not to have a lot of experience with it. It was that light bulb moment for me. And I went and had the good fortune to work at a couple funeral homes and really get to see what it was like. And through the, few years in a couple different states, came to be able to, it's incredible.
And so now, you're there, you've finished your education, you're a licensed director. What's your favorite part of the job?
Oh, yeah. I would say the favorite part of the job, and that's an interesting question because it's the toughest work I've ever done. So there are not a lot of moments that I go, oh, this is just my favorite,
I love this.
But after, there's a lot that goes into it. I mean, there is an unbelievable amount of stress. I tell people it's like being a wedding coordinator, but you have 4 days and I have to pull all that together. So,
and 3 at a time.
Exactly. And so it's a lot of work, but the moments where someone comes up to you after and says, that was incredible. Thank you. That was everything that I wanted, everything they would have wanted. I mean, how many people get to do that?
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about originally when I said, is it unrealistic to think that you can create meaning for people? And
no.
But the story you just told, somebody is telling you that was meaningful for me.
Right.
You succeeded.
And that's why I say it is a lofty goal, but is it attainable? Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's incredible. I tell people, even a wedding coordinator, you may get married several times in your life, but you're probably only going to have the funeral for your mom once.
Yep.
So to be able to be a part of that, that's my favorite moment.
I spoke recently with a gentleman who was concluding a really difficult, tough battle with cancer. And, it looked like his prognosis was good. And he was talking about all of the people who had come together to help him and the cancer support group that exists here in the Gunnison Valley. And the comment that he made was, it's the best community you never wanted to belong to. Do you think it's reasonable to say that funeral directors in general are the best people you never want to meet?
They can be. We don't have a great reputation as a profession, and I think we're working very, very hard to change that public perception.
Why is that, do you think?
That's why I say a funeral director is a new term, is because there's a lot of newness to this profession. And people still remember plenty of times when it was, cold, and it was, unfortunately, there's plenty of negative PR about people taking advantage of people. And
well, that happens.
I always say the news cameras are never going to show up if I pull off a funeral perfectly. There's no good PR about a funeral.
We need to change that somehow.
Yeah. So you only hear about the negative, and I just encourage people to know that is not the norm. There are so many amazing people working so incredibly hard to take care of you. But going back to your comment about community, I would even say it's not necessarily the funeral director because, look, the idea is for you to not necessarily remember me. Yes, I want to create a meaningful service. I want to be somebody that makes a difference in that moment for you. But ultimately, if I do my job right, You're so focused on your loved one that you don't even know that I'm there. That's the community you find when you go through a funeral service. One of the biggest things that's happening in our again, Western culture here is that people are starting to get away from wanting to have a funeral. What's the point? We'll just cremate them and then we'll, have a party on our own later. One of the things that a funeral service provides is a chance for you to see the community around you that supports you and that is there for you. And it gives your community an opportunity to rise up and help you through an incredibly difficult time.
So the funeral's not really about the person who has passed away.
Not really. And I tell people that all the time. It's for those that are left behind.
Mm-hmm. And it can be an enriching experience.
And when you're open to it, it is.
All right. Well, I asked you what your favorite part of the job was. What's your least favorite part of the job?
I don't think I'll ever get used to getting up in the middle of the night and going out on a call. That is, leaving a warm bed to go out on a call is probably my least favorite.
On a Wisconsin winter night.
The interesting thing about that is it's immediately followed by an amazing moment, because getting there and, having an opportunity to be the first person that a family sees, wow, what an opportunity. Every time that happens, I go, okay, this is why I'm here.
Well, so on the subject of being prepared, what advice would you give to people who are starting to think, I really am one of those that have never given this much thought for myself or others? Where do you start?
Go talk to a funeral director. Seriously. I mean, and I know it's an incredibly hard thing for people to do. And I tell people that all the time. I know that walking into a funeral home is the last thing anyone ever wants to do. But walk in. Ask questions. That's part of what we're here to do, is educate. Go in there and see what it's all about. I mean, I tell people the best gift that you can give your family and your children is to have a plan in place. Even just having gone into a funeral home, sat with a funeral director and put your wishes onto paper. Because then your kids are able to go and they already know what you want. They don't have to create that wheel at the moment, and they don't have to do it under a lot of stress and a lot of grief. So number one, go talk to your funeral director. And the second part of that is talk to your family.
That's what came to my mind, is in the process of sitting down with a funeral director and talking about these things, it's going to make it at least more likely, maybe not easier, but more likely that you'll open the conversation with your family also. And maybe even those in your faith community who can start to help lay that foundation.
And I tell people all the time, look, as hard as that conversation is to start and to have now, it is 10 times harder after. Because you're going to have the conversation. When your loved one dies, you're still going to be sitting across the table from me, and I'm still going to ask you the same questions. But it's going to be harder when you're also dealing with the grief and the emotion and the stress and probably, 15 family members and friends calling you, and you haven't slept in 3 days, and it's a lot more stressful. There's so much that goes into it.
Yeah, that is good advice. When you run into people who express an interest in following in your footsteps, are you able to recommend this job? If so, what do you tell them?
Yeah, I mean, I would absolutely recommend this job, even though it is not for everyone. That's why it's such an unusual job, And what I tell people is, it is the hardest thing I have ever done. There are days where it takes everything I have, my time, my emotional, mental, physical health, but it is also at the exact same time the most incredibly rewarding thing I've ever done.
So there's a payoff, but there's also a price.
It's why they say it's a calling. But someone that expresses an interest, and we do come across it a lot, kids in high school or trying to figure out what they want to do. Come shadow me for a day. We're happy to have you. We're happy to explain what we do and what it's like, and see for yourself, is this something you'd want to do? And they always say, you either get in this profession and you're in it for life, or you'll get right back out. So you'll know if it's right for you.
So far we've really kind of been talking about what in the restaurant business would be called the front of the house.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's this whole other thing that happens.
That's right. We call it the back of the house.
The back of the house. Do you really?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my gosh. But the back of the house being where you actually have to come into contact with dead bodies, which is obviously why people get squeamish and squirmy when you talk about this profession. Mm-hmm. What's that like? And what was it like to try to overcome what I think is probably just a natural human distaste for that scenario?
I think the biggest thing, and this was true for me too, but I think the biggest thing is that there's not really actually that much to overcome. It's not as scary as you think. You know, Hollywood has done a great job of making it really scary, and it's just not. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's just not. It's grandma or grandpa, or, you know, it's just, and yeah, let's be real. It's not always pleasant or pretty. I think any nurse or doctor could tell you the exact same, but I try to come at it with, wow, what an honor to be able to care for this person. Mm-hmm. You know, this person has had a long life and they've done many things, and, you know, what an honor.
Sometimes they haven't, though.
And true.
Yeah. Right.
And listen, I mean, I won't sugarcoat it. There are times where this job just sucks. You know, when it's a kid, or, I mean, one of the biggest things that could be a whole nother conversation in and of itself is the opioid epidemic. You know, that is becoming really, really tough to deal with.
That is something that I hadn't considered, and I bet most people haven't, is that we think of the front lines of that epidemic as law enforcement and emergency rooms and families who have to deal with that fallout. But you're on the front lines of that too. And so what's the impact?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. I mean, the what we're seeing from that is, it's just, I mean, it's downright discouraging. You know, there are just so many people that come through. It affects all ages, all, you know, across all social, economical boundaries. It's just such a huge impact. It's such a huge impact to people's communities and their families, and we see it all the time. And we like to think that drug addicts are just that. They're drug addicts, and we have a mental image around that. But
sure, those are the people that are sleeping in the alleyways.
They're sleeping in the alley. They're, you know, chosen their lifestyle. And the saddest thing that I will say is that more often than not, you're seeing people that are trying to turn their life around. I hear it more often than you can imagine, that families come in and say, they have been clean for so long. You know, they'd been clean for 3-4 months. They're trying to get past it. And it's just such an incredibly addictive drug that it pulls them back in, and when it does, it often is, you know, having been clean for a little bit, that's too much.
Then they can't judge.
So yeah, it's I'll tell you what, it's a much bigger problem than people realize.
Well, you're right. That is fodder for a whole nother conversation, which we'll be having more of with others on this issue. Rachel, thanks for coming in and sharing your story with us and sharing a glimpse into this world that we normally don't see.
Thank you. Like I said, I like talking about it, and listen, most funeral directors do. We love people, believe it or not, and we want to talk to you. So go in and see your local funeral director. They want to talk to you about it. They want to let you know what it's all about.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Think Radio is a production of Alan Wartes Media. To contact Alan, visit alanwartesmedia.com.
The show's producer is Issa Forrest. Original music by Issa Forrest. Thanks for listening. Join us next week for another great conversation on Think Radio.